What movement would you mobilize and why?
I would call my movement the mindful movement. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death between people aged 15 and 29. 1 in 3 people are expected to suffer from mental illnesses in their lifetime. So I believe that mobilizing people to strive for mental health would actually fix so many social ills in our society. And that is what I would mobilize.
I hope you guys are good. I hope you guys are well on this beautiful Monday. Tonight we're talking about how lockdown and COVID-19 is affecting children in South Africa. We're talking to Dr. Anusha. She's a psychiatrist, and I think this topic is quite important because I was having a discussion the other day, and the impact that it's had on children, especially in schools, has been enormous. Kids are supposed to be relating to their friends, but then there was this big shift when lockdown hit, and they had to adjust to wearing masks and not being able to play with their friends. Someone told me that they can't be in contact for more than 15 minutes actually. That's how bad it was in the beginning. So I'm really excited to be talking to Dr. Anusha on this interesting topic, because I do believe that children were really affected. And in as much as we want to adapt, and we adapted, and we were struggling, as adults, imagine what kids were going through. And the new generation of kids will not be the same as we were, because at least we were exposed to so many different experiences. But now it's almost like they're confined within the space and regulations just to keep them safe, but at the same time it's affecting the relational side of them. So I'm really excited to be talking to Dr. Anusha about how lockdown and COVID-19 are affecting children in South Africa. So recently we even had that lockdown where schools were closed for quite a while. So I'm very keen, let me just try to get her on. I'm very keen to find out how it affected children and how it affected their mental health. Because there's this notion that that kids are not affected by mental health. But when we spoke to the Zamo on the first Mindful Mondays, I remember he was saying that he had a child as young as 2 years old as a client. And that just showed us that mental health does not discriminate. It affects everyone, and even children. And I think that's the reason for the book that I wrote, Shudufhadzo Musida, for kids to be familiar with those feelings, to know that it's okay to not be okay. Hi, Dr. Anusha, how are you?
Hi, sorry about that. Do you see me now?
Yes, I see you. How are you on this Monday today?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on Mindful Mondays today, and thank you so much for making time.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
So tonight we're going to be discussing how COVID-19 and lockdown have affected children in South Africa. I mean, with the first lockdown, schools were closed for quite a while, and when kids had to go back to school, they had to put on masks. And I know that being relational is quite important for the development of human beings, especially children. And there's this notion in our society that mental health does not affect young kids. But we had a psychologist that told us otherwise. He was talking about how he had a client as young as 2 years old. So I'm very keen to just hear your perspective on that, and just to be educated on this topic. Hopefully people that are watching now who have kids or younger siblings can learn something from this, so we can just be kinder to children and not just assume that they're okay. So thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So I'm just going to start with the first question about the myth that children are too young to have mental health issues, and that they can't be impacted by trauma or stress, and because they don't understand it. Can you help debunk this myth and share some of the stats perhaps on this issue?
So, thank you for having me, and maybe we want to just start with what everybody is facing at the moment, which is COVID-19 and the stress and the trauma of that for children. And I want to say up front that there seems to be this narrative that children are less likely to be affected with mental health issues because they're physically less likely to be as ill as the adults that we know who are impacted by the disease. And I think what we're not talking enough about is the fact that children are disproportionately affected at the moment by the ongoing collective trauma, but also by loss. And I think we haven't had this conversation. about just how impactful the loss has been. So if we think about it, and not just looking at COVID, but we think of the recent unrest and we think about the ongoing adversity that children in South Africa have to face. What we often miss is that we think loss just means loss of a parent, loss of a grandparent, loss of a caregiver. But I think what this lockdown, what this pandemic has shown us is that children are very vulnerable to losses across the spectrum. And if you let me talk a little about that, I think the first thing is that children have lost their sense of normality, of what children are supposed to be doing at this point. And that's a huge loss developmentally. So if you think of, like you're mentioning, really young babies, how do they learn? They learn by exploring the environment. And if your environment is restricted and it's not safe, then children learn that the world is a fearful place. And if the world is a fearful place, then you're less likely to explore and you're less likely to learn from it. And if we look at, like, say, for example, school kids, especially think of the kids in grade 1 last year that couldn't have their first day at school. What a loss is that to be? In terms of memory, in terms of impact going forward. And also socializing, we often will hear children say things like, well, okay, we'll be online and we'll still be in school, but it's not the same. We don't go to school just to learn facts, and just to learn to read and write. You go to school to learn to engage, to share, to make friends, to learn from other children, to learn good values, but also to practice what it's like to be a good human being. And so we've lost that as well. And especially if you think of adolescence, adolescence is a whole different conversation, because how do adolescents again learn to negotiate this crux between being an adolescent and becoming a young adult? You learn to negotiate it with your peers. It's kind of your independence, your agency. I can make my own decisions. I make decisions about contraception, about whether I'm going to drink alcohol, about whether I'm going to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And those kind of things are what we learn from the environment. So I think that the biggest thing that we're not talking about is the loss. So it's loss across the spectrum. And we have to talk more about it. What's it been like for children? And it's been amazingly hard. And that's where the mental health aspect comes in. So we look back and we say, well, everybody's going through the same thing, so it shouldn't really be affecting you as badly if the whole country is doing that. But actually that's not true, because different children and different adolescents come with different vulnerabilities. So if you're a child who really is brought up, for example, in dire poverty, where you don't have access to, say, for example, data or the internet, then you've been disproportionately disadvantaged compared to a child in the leafy suburbs who has access to limitless fiber, who can do the online schooling, who has a nanny at home. And so children are facing this disproportionate disadvantage. And what we're yet to see is how they're going to respond to that. What we anticipate is there will be an increasing level of anxiety, there will be lots of depression, and of course trauma from being left behind through so many adversities. But then again, now even when I have to learn, and where education is supposed to be the, leveling out the playing field, again I'm being disadvantaged. And we do know that the poorest of people have been the ones worst affected, because they can't help not going to work, not using public transport. They can't help the crowded conditions. They have to be at the front line. And, we always talk about frontline workers as in, healthcare workers, but what about the people who are the cashiers, who are cleaning up hospitals, who are doing really important frontline work? How are their children affected by them not being there? And so, there are lots of layers and levels to it, but it's a conversation we need to start having.
No, it's a very important conversation, because I think the normality that you speak about, how a grade 1 could not even have their first day, and that's how we learn to be relational, and how we learn to communicate. There's so many different layers to it, and thank you so much for unpacking that. And I just wanted to find out, what are some of the causes of trauma in children, especially recently? I know as adults we're struggling with anxiety about how to not catch this virus and how to stay safe and protect our loved ones. But for children, what are they facing? What are the traumas that they're facing? What is the reality that they're facing?
So I think, again, it depends on where children are. But what is universally the same for all children is how their caregivers are reacting to that. So you can be in, again, a very privileged environment, or you can be in a very underprivileged environment. But how that adult in the house is responding to that will determine how traumatized the child becomes. So let me give you an example. If you are in, say, for example, an informal settlement, and you are living in a shack, and you have a mom, and you are really scared, and you think, something terrible is going to happen, or my house is going to burn down, or whatever. But if there is an adult who's able to negotiate that for you, who's able to say, it'll be okay. If the rain comes and floods it out, then the firemen are there. Or then the neighbor is going to help us. And look, the church is just down the road. We're going to go there and we're going to get shelter. So that parent negotiates and scaffolds for the child. But if we have a child, say, for example, who could be in a very privileged space and is really fearful that I don't want to go to school because what if I get COVID? What if I pass it to my grandfather? And what if he dies? And if the parent in the house is just as anxious and says, actually, you sure? Actually, that's true. We actually can't touch anything. The sanitizing is not enough. We're all going to die. The vaccine is not going to help us. Bizarre things that are catastrophizing. If the adult is doing that, then that child has a greater vulnerability for developing a traumatic response. Because remember, post-traumatic stress disorder in children is different from adults. And the difference is that the child doesn't have to face the adversity. The child doesn't have to even witness or be present in the trauma. The child just has to hear about it or experience the helplessness from the adult who is relating the story to them. So if you ask me the simple question as to how we pick up the trauma, we screen the parent. We look at how is this child's safe space, whether that's the grandparent or the caregiver or the nanny or whoever it is, how is that person negotiating it for the child? That will determine how well, how poorly you adapt to the stress and what your long-term outcome is going to be.
And how do
so part of
carry on.
Sorry. What part of the message is that when we are bringing children to a doctor or a therapist or to school, the question is we have to ask how their family is doing. Because if this family is falling apart, then there's no way we can just manage the child. We have to be able to look at if the dad is sick, the mom is sick, or if the extended family has just had multiple losses, people lost their jobs, there's no food. Those kind of stresses are worse for a child than you bringing the child to me and saying, can you manage this with therapy? Can I give them some medication? Unless I look at the family and the child in the context of the family, we're not going to be able to manage this. And I think that's really important for teachers as well, because, we get a lot of teachers saying, well, this child is super anxious and they can't sit still and they're really jittery, and is this ADHD, or, are they really not concentrating? And I would suggest that as a teacher, for example, or somebody who's teaching young children, you take a step back and you say, what's happening at home? What's happened in this child's life that is making them so unable to manage everyday stresses? And very often you'll get your answer. And your answer is that there is an adult there who isn't able to manage their own anxiety, their own thing. And don't get me wrong, Shudufhadzo, I'm not saying we're blaming parents. What I'm saying is that parents negotiate how children respond. So the more anxious the child is, the more anxious or the more facilitating the anxiety at home is. And so we have to ask that question. And not everybody is okay at home. Just because people have stuff, we almost assume that they'd be okay. But actually, the opposite might actually be true. That children who have a lot actually lack having that parental input or that caregiver input. They've got the iPad, they've got the whatever things they need to do online. The technology is top notch, but that human contact is often missing. So we need to be careful how we judge and how we expect vulnerability to show. Because you might be surprised. So,
with this being said, parents play a huge role in the child's mental health. But during this time where everyone is struggling with their mental health, or most people are struggling with their mental health, how can they take care of their mental health and put them, because there's this notion that as soon as parents become parents, they have to put themselves second, and maybe that is true, but at the same time, if your mental health is not in a good place, it affects the child. But how do they express themselves? Because the home is supposed to be a safe space for the parent and the child as well, right? So during this time, how do parents become a safe space for children while they're still trying to find a safe space for themselves?
So I think that there are two parts to this question. And the first is that the home is supposed to be a safe space. Now remember, the home is not always a safe space for many women in South Africa. We have high rates of intimate partner violence, and it isn't easy. for mothers to keep the family safe, and fathers as well, right? And there are lots of risks in the environment. So that's the first thing. We need to accept the reality that home is not always the safe place we think it is, right? There's a lot of abuse, there's lots of vulnerability. But the second part to that is how you're supposed to look at yourself is look at yourself through your eyes of the children. Hold a mirror to yourself, right? You are a reflection of what the child sees. And so if you know you're not doing okay, do not pretend, because children can pick it up. If a mom is completely and I'm using mom, but it could be any parent, if they're completely falling apart and they're crying all the time and they aren't able to just get their stuff together, then you need to recognize that you need help. And that help may not necessarily mean that you need to go see a psychiatrist or that you need to see a psychologist. It could be that you're accessing help in your immediate environment. So whether that's an older person in the family or somebody you trust or a faith-based organization or a really good organization like SADC, which is available online or on the telephone through a call center, anonymous, whether it's your primary healthcare center, even if it is people at work that you can confide in. The first step is acknowledging that you are not able to manage your own anxiety, your own mental health issues. Because once you're able to manage that, one is you're able to better respond to your child. But two is you give a really important message to the child, regardless of their age. You say to them that even without saying anything, you give them the message that accepting that you don't always cope, accepting that life is hard, accepting that you need help externally is a very powerful message to give your child. So that children are less likely, when they find themselves in situations where things are overwhelming, they're less likely to pop pills and take an overdose. They're less likely to feel completely overwhelmed, like, say, for example, the boyfriend leaves them or they fail a test. If they haven't been given the example that it's okay to not feel okay and that we can get help and we can feel better, then they feel it's all or nothing. Then they have really the sense of maladaptive coping mechanisms, right? And that's why we see an increase in adolescent suicide attempts or non-accidental injuries that come out in that environment, because we aren't giving children a good example that adults also don't cope, and that even if you don't cope, there is help available which can help you repair that ability to cope. So it is about, when people say, what do children need? One of my favorite things to talk about is what babies need is a well parent. And the same applies across. They don't need stuff. They need a well caregiver. And if you can't be that well caregiver, because sometimes mental health is severe and quite impairing and disabling, then everybody needs that second person who can step in. Whether that's the grandmother, the father, a concerned friend, that could be an older sibling, it could be a teacher, it could be the nanny, it could be the domestic helper. All children need is a well parent, and when that parent is not well, a secondary person who can step in. And that comes from early attachment beliefs, that children don't need parents to be perfect all the time. They just need parents to be reliable and to take care of the world for them when they are young. That's what they need. And it's actually quite simple. And no one is saying that everybody instinctively has this. If I can say, one of the things that we often hear, especially when very young mothers have babies, they'll say, well, don't you have this maternal instinct? And I always like to use the example, do you know what a maternal instinct is from original developmental literature? A maternal instinct comes from early animal and Darwinian theories, where it's about not killing your offspring. It's literally that. So that maternal instinct is not something about, I must give nurturing care, I must be a good mother, I must be better than everybody else. That original maternal instinct was not to kill your child. So we need to move away from these unrealistic expectations that parents just need to be perfect all the time, that they need to be well put together, that they have their stuff together 24 hours of the day. It's not true, it's not helpful, it's not authentic. And you give your child an unrealistic idea of what life is like. Children need to see parents be upset, but they need to see them recover and be able to still have these relations. And the same thing happens in the playground, the same thing happens when they're in other adult companies, and that's why the lockdown's been so difficult, because people haven't socialized. They've just been in their home environment, which may or may not be safe, which may or may not be a great example. So I think that if we just move forward and we say, what do we need children to have to not be more paralyzed by things outside of their control, they need a well parent. And how do we get a well parent? A well parent is one who recognizes that mental health issues can come up across the way at any point in your life, but that there is help. And being able to accept or ask for that help is a very powerful tool to give your child in terms of adaptive coping.
Thank you for reminding us that it's okay to not be okay. I think sometimes when it comes to our parents, we always expect them to be superhuman, where we always just expect them to be okay, and that's what society expects as well. But also looking at them as human beings as well is quite important. But you touched on something that's very, very important, talking about how most homes aren't a safe space for the parent and the child. So in that sort of setting, how is the child's mental health supported? Let's say it is a house that is not a safe space. In most cases, it's filled with domestic violence. How is the child protected? How does the parent protect themselves, but also protect the child without neglecting their own mental health in that sort of setting, especially now when schools are closed, or when schools were closed? School has become a safe space for so many children who live in those kind of situations, but then when they are closed, how is the child protected? How is their mental health protected during that time? And I know it's a difficult question, but it for someone that's watching this and thinking, I try my best to provide a safe space for my child, but at the same time, I can't even provide a safe space for myself. So how do I help make sure that I'm still a good role model to my child, even in that circumstance?
I think it's such a hard one to answer, isn't it? Because it's very easy for people on the outside to say, well, pack your bags and leave. And we know it's not easy.
It's not.
Women are really just so disempowered on so many levels, financially and emotionally. And it's very hard for people to walk away from an abusive relationship. But again, you are the protector of the child. And as you continue to recognize that you become more and more powerless in a really difficult, domestically violent relationship, it really is about reaching that level where you decide it's enough. And it's enough does not mean walking away. It might mean contacting a social worker. It might mean, getting in touch with organizations that help with GBV or with intimate partner violence. It may just be about asking a neighbor, can the child maybe stay for a night or two when you know that, it's the end of the month, the partner's coming home drunk, this is a pattern, I'm not in a space to leave it yet. What can you do in this environment to make it a little safer for the child? Because remember, the ultimate goal is to protect yourself. And if you can protect yourself, you'll protect your child. But we know that it's hard to get up and just leave. And we know women have very few options available. So there are things I would suggest in the environment that you could maybe see. So access help from a neighbor or from, if there's an older sibling, keep them both in that room. You might want to say, well, if my partner or my boyfriend comes over, then you lock the door and you stay in that room. So what it does is it gives children a sense of something happening, something hectic's happening with the adults here, but I'm going to be okay because mom's made sure I'm okay. So there are things. It's not ideal. But there are things that we can do like that. It could also be that you might leave the phone with them, or you might say to them, if things get really bad and you get really scared, then you call, whether it's Gran, or you call the teacher, or you call, the ladies from church, something like that, so that you give children options. And the options may not always be easy for a person sitting in a privileged space to say, well, why are you subjecting your child to that? We see it all the time. It's so hard. It's so hard to keep children safe because it's so hard to keep women safe. But there are tiny things in the home that I think mothers or partners should not really feel despondent that they can't save their children. Because they can. And what you also teach your child is that you're making a plan. That this is a difficult situation. It might actually sometimes be quite dangerous. That women get killed when they choose to leave or they threaten to leave. But what you show your child is, I can make a plan. I have a safe option for you. I give you alternatives. And if that's the best you can do, that's good enough for the child.
And if a child's mental health is affected, what happens if you don't address the mental health issues in children, and what is the long-term impact of that? Because For example, if a child is being bullied at school for however many days or however many months or years, there are long-term side effects of it from what I've read up on it. But even in a situation like that, or even during a time like this of COVID-19 and lockdown, what happens if you don't address the mental health of children during this time or during any situation in the long term? What is the long-term effects of that?
So let me give you a scary fact.
Okay.
You're talking about currently what's happening, right? And so there's a really interesting study called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what that tells you is that before the age of 2, if children have more than 2 adverse experiences, so either a parent with an untreated mental illness, substance use, abuse, poverty, or inadequate food, or opportunities like that, it basically exponentially increases your risk when you're an adult of getting a major medical illness. So things like cancer, hypertension, cardiovascular outcomes. And when you get a higher risk for that, as an adult, you're less likely to function optimally. So basically, everybody suffers economically. So a child from a very young age, the greater the number of adversities, the greater the number of ACEs, they stack up against your genetic profile. And what they do is they alter your vulnerability to physical health conditions. And physical health conditions, as a direct consequence of the mental health conditions early on, impair your ability to be a thriving adult later in life. So it basically sets you up for failure. Having said that, even children who don't have early adversity in that number, but are faced with mental health vulnerabilities like untreated depression, psychotic disorders, or anxiety, or quite impairing developmental disorders that are accompanied by behavioral things, if they don't get help early, and like you're saying, even something socially like bullying, then obviously the long-term impact is most dangerous for us is self-harm. So children try to kill themselves. It increases their rates of suicide attempts, but also increases their rates of long-term mental illness, developing to a severe mental illness. So a severe mental illness like a major depressive disorder, a bipolar disorder, or a psychotic disorder not otherwise specified. And so it becomes more difficult for them to get treatment and more difficult for them to continue with that normal, expected teenage life. And so the long-term impact is a child who doesn't finish school, who might abuse substances earlier to self-medicate because they're not managed for the mental health issues. And then that puts them in a trajectory sometimes which is higher rates of criminal activities. They get themselves into situations where they are at higher risk for sexual abuse, teen pregnancies, and then eventually end up having a less meaningful adult outcome. So the message is not great. The message says that if you recognize it early, we have an opportunity to intervene early. And it's never too late for you to recognize it and seek help. Because people often will say, oh, we talk a lot about the first 1,000 days of life, right? So that's the time where you can make the most impact by the greatest intervention. So the intervention, the earlier, gives you the greatest benefit. But having said that, it's never too late in the first 18 months if you're recognizing it. You can always intervene. There's always help available. And yet, yes, the outcome may not be as great as if you recognized it early, but it's not bad. So we need to be aware of it, and we need to be constantly watching what are our children seeing around us, how are they seeing the adults behave, and how are they responding. What cries are they giving you for help that you're missing? Because children are not going to come to you and say, I feel depressed, I feel anxious, I want to kill myself. They're going to present to you in a variety of ways that you can pick up very early in the home. So, for example, children who are very anxious will start with sleep pattern difficulties. So they're scared to sleep alone, they constantly want the light on, depending on the age, of course, or they want to stay with you, or they want to sleep with their sibling, they wake up several times in the night, or they're requiring more reassurance. So we often will say, you expect a baby to be clingy, but you don't expect a 5 or 6-year-old to be clingy, right? Wanting to hold you, wants to constantly reassure them that they're going to be okay. They have regressed behaviors. They start to suck their thumb. They hold their blankie again. They start to have ritual behaviors. So they want to count stuff, or they want to constantly make the doors be checked. And COVID's done this as well. COVID wants a lot of children to constantly sanitize. They want to check 20 times that their hands are clean, that their mask is clean. So we need to look at this. When we see children who are going outside of what we expect, when it's not okay to just say to them, all right, you've washed your hands, you've been clean, you've put your mask on, it's okay. But they want to do it over and over. Then you've got to notice what that's about. The other thing is, children present, especially school-going children, present with restlessness. And that motor restlessness, irritability, that inability to concentrate often will get misdiagnosed as ADHD. And in fact, I imagine that going forward, as child psychiatrists, we're going to see a lot more of that. People being referred for medication for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which isn't really the diagnosis. It's anxious children, it's traumatized children who are presenting to you with that restlessness, that irritability, that inability to concentrate, that being hyper-vigilant all the time because they're not really reassured or because they have a vulnerability for, anxiety and no one's really directing it in the way that it needs to be.
And during this time of COVID-19 and lockdown, have you seen an increase in the number of children, or in your personal experience, needing help, mental health support?
So I think that the difficulty is that people are not accessing mental health care. They seem to be in this bubble of like, we're all suffering, so it's all okay, we're all in the same zone. And they're missing that children are actually, well, like you say, we would expect, right? More mental health issues. But we're not seeing it. People are afraid to come to the hospital. They're afraid to seek out help. They're keeping children inside. A lot of people are scared to send their children to school. How else are we going to see that children are not doing okay? Unless we allow them a little bit of going back to some sense of normality so that we can see who are the children that are not fitting in, that are not doing okay. So we anticipate there will be an increase in requests for mental health services for children going forward. But we've yet to see that because schools have been closed and hospitals are full, and so we aren't really getting that many to accommodate the COVID physical health crisis, of course. But that means that many children will be screened later than they need to be. And that means we're going to intervene later. So we can expect an uptake, an increase in the presentation still to come. And it's not going to look good.
And currently, above and beyond the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of scary things on TV, social media, and even in our own communities. How do we help children process this, and what do we say to them? Because we're going through a pandemic, but just recently there were so many things that are happening in our country and just in general. So so how do we help children process this?
So I feel quite strongly about that there's this obsessive need for adults to keep informed. I'm not sure why. And they have to check every WhatsApp, and they have to watch every news bulletin, and they have to share every video that's traumatic. And you see looting happening, and you're just sharing it randomly on every WhatsApp group you can think of. And the children are picking up this stress and this distress. And so again, I would suggest and challenge parents to take a step back and ask yourself why. Why do you feel this obsessive need to watch it on every channel, to listen to everything that comes on WhatsApp, to look at it on Facebook or whatever social media? Because all that does is it distresses you as the adult. You feel helpless, you feel angry, and you feel frustrated at your inability to respond to these terrible things that are happening, right? And what does that give you? That gives you post-traumatic stress, that inability to respond, that helplessness, that fearfulness, that feeling really driven and hyper-aroused. All of those are symptoms that are going to pile up together and give you post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if you are watching that, what chance does your child have? I'm not saying don't be informed. Be informed in your immediate area, but enough. Switch off the channel. Don't check your Facebook 500 times. Don't be on your WhatsApp group and open every single video. It's not necessary. We traumatize ourselves, and the more you traumatize yourself, the more you traumatize your children. Because remember what I said at the beginning, children look at you like a mirror. And if they see you distressed and unable to manage, then they become distressed and unable to manage. And so we live in a digital area where it's really hard for us to control what children see, right? But part of helping them make sense of it is having an open discussion. So when they see something really scary, then it's up to the parent to say something like, geez, that's really scary. Oh gosh, that was a frightening thing to see. Because what that does is it gives the child permission then to say, yes, actually, that was freaking me out, But if we're not talking about it, children can't process it in a way that helps them make sense. And so they have these fantasies of how terrible things are without actually having a reality check because the parents are not helping negotiate that. So we need to talk about it. We need to ask children. And so when we see children are actually keeping to themselves, or they're quite clingy, or they're not wanting to explore stuff, then we need to ask, why? Let's explore this, What are you afraid of? If you go to school, what are you scared of? What happens then? And say this happens, then what? What do you think is the worst that can happen? How can we help the situation? Because if we don't want to talk about that, or if we're having these conversations, like for example, we're listening to the president or somebody say, well, school's opening tomorrow. And if we have a whole lot of parents around in the living room saying, oh my God, they're not caring about us, and the teachers are going to get infected, they're going to come home and they're going to infect everybody else. The child listening to that is having a really hard time processing it. And you're making them more anxious. So separate adult conversations for adults and keep it out of the realm of the children. And if children have to watch the same news bulletin with you, the same thing on TV that is important, help them process it. Give them words to the visuals. Say, sure, that looked really scary, huh? Well, I wonder what happens now. Luckily, the firemen are there, or luckily the police came in, or thank goodness we have the SANDF there. Even if you as the adult think that they didn't come soon enough, or they didn't do what they're supposed to do, your child doesn't need to know that. You have to separate that out. And our big mistake we make often is we think the children are friends. They're not your friends. They need a responsible adult. They need you to take control, to tell them things are going to be okay, and to make sure you try the best ability that you have to make sure things are okay. And so we need to constantly reflect on our own responses to things, because we very often forget, and even a teenager, right? A teenager is still not an adult. There really is no need for you to be discussing in intimate detail all the things that could possibly go wrong, because children don't need to know that.
And you're absolutely right. It's quite important for adults to be safe spaces for children, because especially during this time, there's a lot of reassurance needed, especially for children who have not been exposed to any of this or don't even have the capacity to deal with it. And another thing that has accompanied the pandemic is grief and losing loved ones, and that is very traumatic and can be very difficult for children to process. How can we help children deal with grief?
So again, how are we dealing with the grief? If it's something we can't talk about and something we can't cry about, then what message are we giving the children? And if it is your parent that died, then you need to express that grief. And you need to say, sometimes mom needs a quiet time, or dad needs a time apart. It's been very upsetting for him, for his own dad to die, or something like that. But if it is in a case where, okay, so the grandma has died, or somebody in the family's died quite unexpectedly, we're all quite traumatized about it, rituals are really good for children because it helps them feel contained. And by rituals, I don't mean scary rituals, like get them involved with the actual process of burying and things like that. Rituals in terms of small things that you can do to help them make sense of it. So, little, depending on the age of children, small children might want to write a letter to the person who's passed on, might want to take a flower and leave it somewhere and say that's for them. They're going to see it. And depending on what your religious or your background is to explain what happens when people die, I think that can be quite containing. Have that conversation according to your own cultural beliefs, but also allow children to make some meaning of it. So, draw a picture of when we were all happy together. Or, let's draw something for where we think grandma is, and grandma's going to be looking at us. Let me write a little note and fold it up, and it's for grandma to take in my dreams. Let me build something outside, whether I plant a little flower or I make a little stone garden or something that has some meaning as a tribute, as a ritual to allowing children to transition into accepting the loss. And then we have to talk about it. We can't pretend it's all okay. If somebody went into hospital and got really, really sick, as we've seen with COVID, and died, then it's really important for parents to have that conversation about when we drive past. So, for example, I work at a state hospital in Cape Town. We drive past Tygerberg Hospital. We want parents to say, that's where, so-and-so went and died. And it must be very scary to see that hospital. Or when we're driving past, we might say, I feel so sad when I drive past because it makes me remember how sad it was or how sick they were. But sometimes people do better. They're not suffering anymore. So we reframe it for them. And we say, grandma was really, really sick and really was not okay. But then, she was relaxed after that. then she wasn't suffering anymore. And then it was okay. And children, you'll be surprised, accept very simple explanations. What's bad is not talking about it.
I'm so glad that you touched on that, because one thing that you've been highlighting throughout this entire talk is the importance of honesty from parents, but also the importance of just reassurance to the kids. Above and beyond that, what kind of help is available for children dealing with trauma and mental health issues or mental health issues?
Well, we're lucky that we do have resources in terms of call centers, for example, whether that's a South African Depression Anxiety Group, whether that's Childline. If you Google, there's lots of pharmaceutical companies that also offer these kind of free online call center options with volunteers to look after children. But sometimes, children don't need a lot. Sometimes they just need, like you're saying, that reassurance, and it can come from a very simple, easily accessible space, like a counselor at school or the teacher at school, or maybe somebody that you're used to that helps you sort of spiritually, or an elder person in the family, somebody that can process it for the child or hold them enough. Obviously, when it comes to the point where that's not enough, then there are many public health facilities where children can access care. And we're very quick to take children if they break a bone, or if they get cut, or, if they need a physical health option.
Yeah.
But we really step back and we don't access mental health. But whoever offers you the physical health service for your child, whether that's a well baby clinic, or whether that's an immunization space, or whether that is a pediatric outpatients in the clinic, they can also offer you mental health support. That's what they're there for. And so we need to be open to that. We need to say, just like we would heal a broken bone, we can also heal a broken heart. We can also help your mind a little. People are trained to do it. Whether they're a nurse or a psychologist or a doctor, it's part of their training. We just need to access it. And so we need to not be afraid, and we need to call out the stigma. And we need to say that, mental health has far-reaching consequences for physical health outcomes, like I told you later on. And so we need to help early on with support. It's very rare children need medication. It's very rare. And I think parents are scared of that. Parents are like, I don't want to medicate my child. I don't want my child to be a zombie. It's very rare for them to need that. And children who need it genuinely are impaired, and that's where a professional will decide if they need medication or not. But children do very well with supportive counseling, with psychotherapy, with just having that reassurance. So I think we don't see that often because people don't bring their children often. But there are many success stories. We just have to be open to accessing it. And we need to stop using language that is demeaning for people with mental health problems, and we need to not be saying things like, oh, he's crazy, or my child is not mental. We say it very disrespectful tone of voice. But if we start changing that language, the way we speak about it, we say, my child is struggling. My child really struggles to process that. Or my child is really sensitive and needs a little bit more support. Then we make it more accessible. And we make other people look at it and feel fearful of accessing that help.
I think even what you just said now is even applicable to adults, how we speak to one another and the language that we use, especially when someone wants to seek help. One thing that we preach on Mindful Mondays, and one thing that you reiterated, is the fact that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to seek help, but then we need to change the conversations that we have in our societies, in our homes, in our communities, in our schools, to make that a reality for children especially, but also for one another, because most of the time you find that, especially during this time, we still expect people to be okay. We still expect them to just function as if we're not living through a pandemic. So thank you so much for basically just educating us on that. One last thing from my side, I just wanted to find out, during this time of where we're trying to basically recover from the pandemic, how important is mental health education in schools?
I mean, it's crucial. It should have been happening all along. But it really is unforgivable if now, knowing what we know, we don't make an active attempt to address it. And whether that is, and no one is saying the teachers need to be the expert, but the teachers need to call on the Department of Education and their resources, whether that's school-based learner support, whether that's psychologists, whether the Department of Education needs to rethink and say, what is it that our schools need now that they didn't have before? Something as simple, Shudufhadzo, as in, does your school have a bullying policy? You'll be shocked at how many schools don't have that. And if they don't have that and they say they will deal with it when it happens, that's not acceptable. Now is the time for us to say there are certain almost red flags we can predict children are going to struggle with. So let's upfront see what do we have. So the children start school again. What is there in place for should there be bullying? Can I see the policy? Children we know have lost lots of family members. What is the option at the school for contacting a counselor? Yes, schools don't have money for lots of things, but the education department has a responsibility. The basic education department has a responsibility, and they have it in their mandate that they have to provide some kind of counseling or school-based learner support. So where is that? You need to ask your school that. Where is that? Who are you contacting from the Department of Education to make sure that should my child be suffering, I have that option? We also need to then ask, are the teachers okay? Teachers have lost loved ones. Teachers have been really ill as well. What's the support base for them? We have lots of support for healthcare workers who are facing at the front line of COVID, but what's there for teachers? And if not, why not? And whose responsibility is that? It's the Department of Education. So I think we need to step back and we need to make people accountable for putting mental health at the forefront of education. Because we see huge numbers. We're doing a study at the moment at Stellenbosch University and with Oxford University looking at how parents and families and children coped during the lockdown and after that in terms of mental health outcomes, and we can anticipate already things are not going to be easy. The demand for support is going to be much greater than we ever imagined possible. And it's not over yet, right? It's not over. Life has changed. People have lost their jobs. People have lost families. And so if we're not preparing for that, then we're just setting our children up for failure. And then when they drop out of school and they use substances and they try to harm themselves, are we going to sit back and we're going to say, oh, look, they're just attention seeking? Or are we actually going to take a hard look as adults and say, how have these children been supported? And if not, why not? Whose responsibility is it? It is the education department, it is government responsibility, and you as the parents are the only advocate that your children will have for them at this point. So your role as parents, whoever's listening in here, is not just to sit back and to accept. It's to be vocal advocates for the rights of your children. We know what's going to happen, we know what's coming. Let's hold people accountable who need to be accountable.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anusha. Thank you so much. I think this was a very, very informative session, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and educating us on how COVID-19 and lockdown has been affecting children in South Africa, but even above and beyond that, the mental health of children in general. So thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. I hope people learned something.
Thank you to everyone for watching Mindful Mondays tonight. We're joined by Dr. Anusha talking about how COVID-19 and lockdown has affected the mental health of children in South Africa. I am going to save this live for those that joined late, but thank you once again. Have a lovely evening.